And we are ready. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar, FASD Fundamentals for Camp. So Karen and I last year did a series of presentations for a variety of camp teams and thought what better way to make sure this is properly incorporated into training plans and make it easy and efficient. We developed this webinar and this specific presentation. So we hope you enjoy it and are able to follow along with the slides and take notes as needed. My name is Michelle Hughes, and I am an FASD coordinator at Sunbeam Developmental Resource Center, working alongside Karen. We are two of the provincially funded FASD coordinators who are in our region. My background is a lot of camp. I went to school for recreation. My focus was on community development and therapeutic rec. Spent many summers as a camp leader and coordinating camps, so definitely understand the inclusion elements. I came to this role at the urging of Karen and the encouragement of Karen. My son lives with an FASD, and I'm passionate about this type of work, making sure we're building FASD inclusive communities.
All right, and I'm Karen Huber. I'm the other FASD coordinator at Sunbeam, and I've been working in developmental services and children's mental health for many years. And I've been happy to offer camp trainings for many years now, and I'm happy to have Michelle join me as we show you, how to better support kids and youth at camp who have an FASD.
A few acknowledgements we always start with is one, understanding FASD as a societal issue is fundamental to this presentation. And as such, some key understandings are that we acknowledge the experience of pregnant persons and strive to be inclusive of everyone, and the language we may use in this presentation may include woman, mother, and person. And culturally competent services and supports include thinking about how specific groups of individuals may view the use of alcohol and pregnancy, both individually and combined. FASD is something that is everywhere. You may be serving a lot of campers and their families who live with an FASD, but they might not be diagnosed. And through the course of this presentation, we are going to show you how FASD is everywhere in society, its impacts, the stigma, etc. So this is one of the favorite slides that we like to use. If you ever are seeking factual evidence-based information on FASD, we highly recommend canfasd.ca. They have a lot of really great resources. FASD is a global health issue, a disability rights issue, a women's health issue, a food security issue, a housing issue, a criminal justice issue, and a mental health issue. You cannot solve or address one without addressing all, and that is the crux of FASD, and we'll tackle some of that in our presentation today. What's really important, and I'm sure as leaders in camp environments, you are aware of this already, but we believe strongly in person-centered language, and it's important in terms of stigma of FASD and disability across the board that we remember that everyone has a name, people are not their disabilities, and understand that individuals are seeking a sense of belonging in their communities, and we are only a small part of that journey. For families and kids in camp, please know that you are a significant part of that journey during that short summer timeframe, whether you have campers with you for 1 week, 2 weeks, 6 weeks, or 8 weeks. And understand that individuals come with experiences of trauma and inequality. So what is FASD? And I'm sure the more and more Karen and I do these presentations, and we have types of audiences like yourselves, we ask, and often people do know what FASD is, but if we were to ask the question compared to other more prevalently promoted or talked about or destigmatized diagnosis, we wouldn't necessarily see the same balance of people who understand. So we want to make sure that everyone knows that fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, FASD, not FAS, not FASD, is a diagnostic term used to describe the impacts on the brain and body of individuals prenatally exposed to alcohol during pregnancy. FASD is a lifelong disability. There is no cure. Individuals with FASD may experience challenges in their daily living and need support with motor skills, physical health, learning, memory, attention, emotional regulation, and social skills. However, each individual with an FASD is unique and has areas of both strengths and challenges. You may be supporting an individual who needs help with all of those mentioned areas at any given time, or different spans of lifetime, more help in other areas. So the prevalence of FASD, CAN FASD did a study in 2017 that showed 4% of the population in Canada had a diagnosed FASD. And recently, a US-based population study came out with a prevalence rate of 7%. And again, this is speaking to diagnosed individuals, not those who are misdiagnosed, underdiagnosed, or not at all diagnosed. There are higher rates of FASD in special populations. This is a pretty recent study. There are rates about 10 to 40 times higher in special education settings, correctional facilities, children in care, Indigenous populations, and specialized clinical settings. That does not mean, however, that that is only where individuals with FASD are, and we have to critically think about how we get to those numbers. Are those individuals in those areas because of the effects of stigma? Is it because of disproportionate care, marginalization, lack of diagnosis, lack of access to supports? But that is how prevalent FASD is. And when we are meeting with individuals back in the day, when we did this all in person, we would ask everyone to be honest with yourself about your first impressions of FASD. You don't have to tell everybody, this isn't raising your hand or being interactive, but really think about when you hear FASD, what are the first thoughts that come to your mind? And oftentimes people come from different forms of bias and different areas of understanding. But we want to challenge those first impressions if they are negative, if they are rooted in blame, and if they are solely pointed at negative elements of an individual living with an FASD or to a pregnant person or woman who had a prenatally exposed pregnancy. When we look at these advertisements that were brought together for the presentation, the commonality is it just looks like it's something simple. A woman's hand over a drink means all a woman doesn't have to do is drink. A woman needs to choose the baby or the bottle, and it's just that simple, where it absolutely is not. These are not effective messages, and there is a lot more to the conversation around FASD and stigma than just a simple do not drink. So stigma is pervasive in FASD for a variety of reasons, mainly because of alcohol. Alcohol has a very conflicted relationship in our society where it is, revered and, and advised against all at once. So how do we start eliminating stigma? We involve individuals living with an FASD in the conversation about eliminating stigma and what supports and services are needed and what FASD truly is. Providing the community with accurate information. This is a significant part of the work that Karen and I do to ensure that we're getting proper information to the community and having the conversations and allowing people in positions of support to have those conversations with other individuals. And ensuring language is inclusive and judgment-free. And if you're interested in your camp experience having a completely inclusive language around FASD, again, you can go to canfasd.ca and they have an excellent language guide that you can find through this link or simply by entering language guide in the search bar. So intervention supports and building blocks are the next element we're going to go through, and how we support, how we look at FASD, how we support those, and how we get structures in place that make sure that individuals with an FASD have the most positive camp experience.
All right, so we're going to start with a video. This is Kim Barthel. She's an occupational therapist and an expert in the area of FASD, and she talks about sort of the different parts of the brain impacted by prenatal alcohol exposure, but also how that plays out in day-to-day life.
The right orbital frontal cortex, that same structure that is for gleaming and beaming, is the senior executive of your thinking brain. Who'd have thought that the part of your brain involved in falling in love and social interaction is the thinking component of your nervous system? It's the senior executive of your ability to have impulse control, decision making. That term working memory is also homed or has its home in the right orbital frontal cortex. The ability to bring information from history, this will have great significance when I tell you this, into the front of my brain, work with it in the moment, and make future projections is all part of this frontal cortex, okay? Being able to say, well, you know, the last time I did that didn't work out so well, and now I have a situation here in the moment that's kind of similar. Maybe I need to make a different choice. We call that self-reflection. The other structure that's really important in regulation is a bridge called the corpus callosum. There is a band, thick band, that help us move back and forth. It says, maybe I shouldn't tell my boss off today, or be able to acknowledge that you're feeling sad, or acknowledge that you're feeling uncomfortable. When this band is thinner, either due to fetal alcohol spectrum disorder or trauma, the ability to move back and forth between those two sides of the brain becomes harder. So your ability to have a secure attachment, if you wanted one, your brain couldn't do it for you. It would be harder to be able to move information back and forth. Now, I mentioned to you earlier that in order for us to take care of and regulate ourselves, we need a frontal cortex, and we need another part of the brain that I started talking about that I'm going to pick up on now, called amygdala. This tiny little almond in your brain works so quickly that it comes online long before the cortex ever has a chance. Its job is to keep you alive. Amygdala scopes the scene of the environment around you and tells your brain, pay attention. So when the snake crawls in the room, your amygdala notices it. It doesn't know whether it's a garter snake or a rattlesnake. It just notices it as a threat or a potential threat. The job of the amygdala is to send out massive amounts of adrenaline to the rest of the brain and the body to get you ready for fight, flight, fright. So the architect of our nervous system played a big joke on us in that we are so easily upregulated and so slowly downregulated. It isn't until my right orbital frontal cortex gets in the game that I'll ever even have the ability to turn that amygdala down. Otherwise, I'm left with a raw Amy running the show. And that's what happens in fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. We've got an amygdala running the show without a frontal cortex to modulate its response. The other thing that you and I do is have a memory. Hippocampus helps you lay down new memory so that when you do something, you don't have to keep relearning it. The hippocampus, typically when there is a tremendous amount of emotion involved, takes one trial for you to remember because your survival depends on it. Except if I have FASD. This particular structure is one of the most damaged structures in fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which means that the way that I store my memories are going to be inconsistent or diffusely distributed. It's not going to have a nice, neat file drawer to go back to and pull out. That's why sometimes they can do it and sometimes they can't. It depends on how much of that brain is regulated in the moment.
So as we move forward, we're going to talk a lot about that frontal cortex, and that's where the executive functioning is housed. And that'll be the first thing that we talk about. But we're also going to talk about a lot of other things as we move forward, and some of the primary characteristics and common challenges. So executive functioning is what she was talking about when she was talking about the frontal cortex. And that's, the front part of your brain. It's the last one to be developed in utero. And it's really the brain's air traffic control center. It's the boss. It's the one that tells everybody else what to do. And kids with an FASD often have a really difficult time with their executive functioning. So that air traffic control, it's a system in charge of making sure things get done right from the planning stages until the job is completed and the final deadline. And there is all the things that your executive function needs to do on a daily basis. It needs to analyze the task and figure out what needs to be done, plan on how to handle the task, getting organized, figuring out how much time is needed, making adjustments if things don't necessarily go the way you wanted, finish the task in the time allotted, and then of course managing your emotions while doing all those things. So just thinking about all the things that you needed to do to be here today, to listen to what Michelle and I have to say. And if one little thing goes wrong, it kind of throws your day off. But for kids with an FASD, those little things really throw their day off because they have such a hard time managing their executive functioning. I'm going to play another video for you. This is Nate Sheets, and he talks about spoon theory and executive functioning. And I think this can be language that you can use in your camp environment about sort of wondering how many spoons a child has when you're asking them to do something or they're engaging in a task. But I'll let him say more about that.
Hi everyone, my name is Nate Sheets with Organ Behavior Consultation, and in this video we're going to be talking about the concept of executive functioning fuel, or spoon theory. There's a critical set of skills called executive functioning skills, and those are housed in the very front of our brain. They're the last part of our brain to have evolved, and they are, in a sense, what makes us the most human. These skills include things like emotional regulation, working memory, planning, abstract thought, impulse control, and many others. And what we want to talk about today is how we only have a limit as to how many times we can do these tasks each and every day. This is something that's true for all of us, not just kids and adults who have fetal alcohol spectrum disorders and other developmental disabilities. Each time you use a skill in the executive functioning category, you use a little bit of what I refer to as executive functioning fuel. This means that as the day goes on, the more and more stressors you get, or the more and more times you have to use these skills, you're going to feel more and more wiped out and be less able to do them later. Since emotional regulation is a big part of the executive functioning system, what we see with people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders and other developmental disabilities is that the more and more stressed out they get, the more and more reactive they come to small stressors. You can probably relate to this. If you've ever spent the first part of the day with really intense focus on something like studying for a class, as the day goes on, you feel more and more physically and emotionally tired. That's the concept of executive functioning fuel, or spoon theory. Spoon theory was created to help those of us who don't experience a disability or chronic illness understand what it's like for those people that do experience it to go throughout their day-to-day life. You can think of everybody as having a certain number of spoons. If we're talking about somebody with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, you can go ahead and take away some of these spoons because they have low cognitive skills in many areas, meaning they're already at a disadvantage. Each time the person uses something in their executive functioning toolkit, such as emotional regulation or holding their attention, a spoon is taken away, which means as the day goes on, they're going to have less and less to work with. You can replenish your spoons by taking a nap, eating something with glucose, or just taking a break. So it really isn't a surprise that so many of our kids do pretty well in school, but display most of their behaviors at home. When they start off the day going to school, they have more spoons. By the time they've used all of their attention, emotional regulation, and impulse control, and they get home, there's barely any left. There are proactive things we can do, as well as suggestions in the cognitive support process that allow us to assess where a person is at with each skill and to provide them some support. This can help our days go much more smoothly. For example, if we know a kiddo is coming home with very few spoons left, then we're going to need to do something immediately to help them replenish their spoons. If we sit them down and expect them to do 45 minutes of homework, you're probably going to see some resistance and some behaviors. Or if we expect them to do anything that involves an executive functioning skill, such as working memory, attention, transitioning, emotional regulation, and impulse control. So as we move through these videos together, start to ask yourself about your awareness of how many spoons your child has. By just simply understanding that your child may have very little executive functioning fuel left, you're going to be able to adjust expectations much more and proactively think of solutions to help them get through the rest of their day. In the next several videos, we're going to be talking about specific cognitive skill deficits and specific things that you can do to help enhance those skills or provide cognitive support for those skills. If these videos have been helpful to you, please like our page on Facebook or subscribe to us here on YouTube. We're going to
All right, we'll stop him there. So he really sort of demonstrates how you might want to think about how many spoons a child has when they arrive at camp. Kids with FASD will, often look like they have the energy to do things, but really their brains might be tired. So just because they look like they're, able to do a task doesn't necessarily mean they actually have the executive functioning fuel to do the task. Having energy and having executive functioning fuel are two very different things. So kids with FASD think about, talks the talk, but can't walk the walk. So, we had talked before about, how kids might be able to tell you all the rules of the game. But then when it comes to thinking those through and actually using them in the moment, can be really difficult. So you might see them really trying their best, and they've got really good intentions, but often they will make the same mistakes over and over again, despite consequences. And not necessarily consequences that you're going to, provide because of misbehavior, but consequences as in, not doing well in the game or having maybe some poor peer relationships because of that. They might have difficulty organizing themselves. Impulsivity is an executive function. So you'll often see impulsive behavior, and you'll also see rigid thinking. So some black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking, the inability to shift from one task to another. So they really do have a difficult time adapting to change. And because they are trying their very best, they often are surprised when things don't go well for them. Because they really are trying, and that executive functioning just lets them down. They might not complete tasks because, they might not know what step comes next, and it's easier just to quit than to, try to access that next step in their brain. So we need to make sure we're supporting their brain by establishing an executive assistant, and that can be a person, that can be a thing, that can be a visual schedule. That can be making sure that you're providing good cues, reminders for transitions, and also just increasing supervision and being there to be able to support up that executive functioning. Adjusting.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Michelle.
Sorry, I was just going to say too, when Karen talked about talk the talk, and we get to language in a bit, but again, don't be fooled when they are very eager to make sure all of their fellow campers know the rules. They will tell all of their fellow campers the rules to the letter. And then when they don't follow through, they get frustrated for a variety of reasons, as Karen just said, but that also can be mistaken for intentional behavior when it's not. They will be like, they will repeat the rules back to you, but they are very keen to make sure everybody's following the rules, even though they're not able necessarily to always follow through. And that's not every game, but if there's a lot of instructions and a lot of moving pieces, you will probably see these challenges. But if you're playing something simple in small groups with literal rules, you would probably see them succeed a little bit better.
Right. Okay, and then we couple, executive functioning deficits with a slow processing pace, and we can sort of amplify some of the difficulties that they might have. Whoops, I'm gonna go back there. So 10-second kids in a 1-second world, it literally may take them 10 seconds to process the information you're telling them. So what we want to do is we want to make sure we give them lots of time to process what you're saying. You might see them ignoring, it might look like not listening, but if we slow down and give more time, use fewer words, give one instruction at a time, kids are more likely to be able to keep up with the pace of conversation. So just ensuring that we slow things down and literally give a direction with 2 or 3 words and count to 10 in your head to see if there's follow through, because sometimes they just need that amount of time to process what we're asking them to do. And then Michelle sort of touched on the memory piece when she was talking about the rules of a game. But I think at camp too, don't expect them to be able to remember what you did yesterday and what the expectations were, because their memories are leaky and faulty, and they might learn a simple task really quickly, but then also forget it just as quickly. So we always have to reinforce that learning by reminding them what the expectations are and what the rules are. So sometimes they can also look unmotivated, or they can look lazy because they're not sure of what to do next. And it's not because they're unmotivated or lazy. It's because that initiation isn't happening for them. Their brains just don't do that. They don't know what comes next. So we often have to prime their brains to know what comes next. They also might make up stories to fill in gaps in their memory, and we'll get into what that looks like in a little bit, but it's something called confabulation. So we see kids with an FASD not necessarily learning from experience and performing inconsistently. And we also need to remember that just because they don't learn from experience doesn't mean they can't learn a task over and over again, right? We have to make sure that we're reminding them of what's expected and what the rules of a game are, or how to enter into play in an appropriate way. We just have to have that hand over hand approach. So be patient. Believe them when they say they don't know, keep those environmental supports consistent, and really be willing to assist on their most difficult days. Sometimes that can be every day, right? So remembering that we can't over support someone. We're not enabling them. We just need to remember to develop routines that are good for them, and we can't sort of over program in that area. And then in addition to learning and memory, there's a special type of memory called working memory that temporarily stores and manipulates information. So think about remembering a phone number, or the things you need at the grocery store, the 3 steps you need to do to sort of get ready in the morning. Those things, that's your working memory, helping you out to remember those things. And kids with an FASD often have a difficult time with working memory. So you might see them, forgetting steps in a game, or not having all the supplies to do a craft because you told them to get, the tape, the paint, the sheet of paper and the paintbrush, and they're going to forget things, right? They're only going to come with a couple of the supplies. So we need to figure out ways of ensuring that we break that down for them so they can remember those things. So thinking about chunking information, limiting language, pairing pictures with instructions. I like multiple ways into the brain, right? Through your eyes, through your ears. And then also one of the key learnings too is don't assume that they can repeat what you ask them to do, that it's in their memory, right? They're also good little parrots. And just because they can say it back to you doesn't mean they're necessarily remembering it.
So certain things like Karen said, at camp, we do the same thing. Camps are actually quite structured environments if they're done well, which I'm sure yours are. But that structure is fundamentally important, and you can't just assume that you have your schedule and that's all that's needed. It might actually require each game that you play regularly, if it's capture the flag, if it's, I don't know, but any of those games, maybe just a small visual to remind, or something like at the end of the game, what was this game called? Did you like this game? What did you like about the game? Just as a debrief, and that would help trigger that memory. Also know that every game you're probably going to have to go over the rules again, or they will remember rules, but certain things would slip and they just can't avoid that. So you have to have very clear instructions for your day. And that's not just for the camper, that's for you as well, because they will have a great day if they have predictability.
Exactly. So here's this concept of confabulation. And I think if, we've been a camp counselor before, or you've worked with any kids with special needs, you can think about kids that, tell some tall tales sometimes. And this storytelling is actually part of the brain difference. And they're trying to fill in the gaps in their memory when they don't know really what else to say. So they fabricate ideas, they talk a lot, they tell tall tales. And it feels like it might be lying, but it's not necessarily the case. They're filling in gaps in their memory. And it's challenging to know what to do with that, right? Because sometimes you want to challenge it when it's such a far-fetched idea or story, but really you just believe them, you validate them, and you sort of move on. But I have another video from Nate here, and he talks really well about what confabulation is all about. I'll let him explain it.
No one likes a liar. When we think someone is lying to us, we may feel annoyed, insulted, or hurt. How could they think that we're dumb enough to believe their lie? Or maybe we feel betrayed, or perhaps we did believe what they told us, and now that we discovered that it wasn't true, we feel as if we've been manipulated. But here's the thing, oftentimes what looks like a lie and sounds like a lie isn't a lie in the traditional use of the word. There could be multiple legitimate brain-based reasons you're getting information out of someone that's incorrect. Responding to them as if they're intentionally lying to you and punishing them is essentially punishing them for something that's out of their control, and that doesn't help anyone. In this video, we'll talk about one of the more common brain-based reasons that you may find yourself in a situation with someone who appears to be lying to you, but isn't. In fact, they could be doing something that all of our brains do, confabulation. I often work with people who have a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or FASD, but today we're going to learn about ideas that apply to everyone, regardless of whether or not they have a developmental disability. Confabulation happens when your brain fills in the blank as you're remembering something. Like I said, all of our brains do this filling in without us even knowing it. This is because our memories are imperfect, and so the brain lends us a hand by confabulating missing details. We don't know when we're confabulating because it feels as if we're accessing a normal, intact memory. Most of us experience memories as if a film is playing in our head. Each time we remember it, it feels as if it's the same film that we've watched many times before. We often feel as if we're there in the memory, reliving the moment. And so it makes sense that most of us trust our memory. But the truth is, neuroscience research shows that each time we remember something, our brains distort it. And if there's no memory in place, our brains will often confabulate rather than letting us worry about missing details. So why am I talking about the flaws in everyone's memory? Because I want you to know that memory for everyone is fragile and accurate and easily distorted, and none of us are the exception to this. And remember, people with FASDs tend to have additional memory problems on top of the ones that everyone else has. So if a child is put in a situation where memories are demanded, their brain may begin to fill in the blanks. When it works, it can be a helpful tool, but for kids or people with FASDs, the confabulation isn't always correct, but it feels correct, just like confabulation feels correct when we do it. So how do we think it must feel to be accused of lying when we're actually just confabulating? It's probably confusing, frustrating, and in some cases, it would feel unfair. I see it all the time. And if we're constantly telling people who are confabulating that they're lying, they may not have an accurate idea of what lying really is, because we've been giving them inaccurate words to describe what's happening. We say things like, "Why did you lie to me? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" No wonder they may get defensive. They trust their perception just as much as we trust ours. Okay, so confabulation is when the brain fills in the blank with what feels like a normal memory. But people with FASDs and other developmental disabilities may be more likely to engage in confabulation, not just because of their memory issues, but because of multiple struggling cognitive skills. We should note confabulation is just one of many different things that can make a situation appear as if someone is lying to you when they aren't. So even if you're sure that the person isn't confabulating, you should explore other possibilities before accusing someone of lying. If this is something that you want us to talk about in more detail, please leave us a comment and let us know. A big part of addressing confabulation is acceptance, which is part of the neurobehavior model developed by Diane Malbin. Whether we're talking about someone with FASDs, developmental disabilities, or just kids who have a lot of brain development left to do, we can expect that confabulation will happen. We can try many different proactive strategies to prevent confabulation, such as using visuals when communicating or giving time to process. But the reality is, confabulation may always happen to some degree. It's really important not to allow these situations to be stressful. Ongoing stress, especially about things that we have no control over, can be traumatic and damaging to our relationships. Now, guys, I'm not saying that intentional, planned out lying never happens. It does. But because so many other things could be going on, my personal approach is to assume the best. That means that if a client is giving me information that I know isn't true, I need to be thinking about the supports that they need. And even if they are intentionally lying, perhaps they just don't know what else to do. So my focus should be less on the fact that they shouldn't be lying to me and more on how I can help prevent this from happening in the future. I hope that you found this video helpful. If you haven't already, please consider liking Organ Behavior Consult.
All right. And he has a lot of other really great videos on his YouTube channel if you want to check them out. All right. So when we think about language, two types of language that we can think about. Well, there's actually three. There's expressive language, receptive language, and then your social language. But expressive language is like the words you know, the vocabulary you use, how you express yourself, how you communicate with others. And often kids with an FASD are really good at that. Where lies the issue is in their receptive language, bringing in information and using it in a meaningful way. Is where they can fall short. So thinking about, you might see really gifted speakers with rich vocabulary, they're engaging, but there might be little depth in what they're saying. And they might have a really difficult time bringing in information that you're saying to them. So think about having a slow processing pace, deficits in your executive functioning, and then issues with your receptive language, how hard it must be to communicate with people and understand what people are saying and use it. And then there's social language. So that's like misinterpreting social cues, being able to understand and be reciprocal in relationships, understanding give and take in a relationship, how to enter into play. All those things are your social language skills. So because of those higher expressive language skills, people can assume that they're more capable than they are. But really, if you scratch the surface, you'll see a really thin veneer of competence. So also in their language, they're very literal, right? So avoid sarcasm and vague questions and give them time to process. Say what you mean and mean what you say and be really concrete in what you're asking them. Again, pair pictures with words and provide written instructions. And don't assume that their language is indicative of their abilities, right? Because they can perform, like their language skills can perform at a higher rate than sometimes other kids, right? But then that leads us to expect more from them. So we have to be really careful that we don't do that. And then this is sort of cognition and brain differences, right? So people with a developmental disability often, an intellectual disability often have an IQ in the, in the very low range. And that's not the same for kids with an FASD. They can often have an IQ in the average range. And IQ really is what you know, right? It's the information that's in your brain. And really the difference between FASD and other kids is, they have a really hard time accessing what's in their brain because of the poor executive functioning, the slower processing pace, the language and memory issues. So the filing cabinet on the left is that, it's showing what we would think of as a typical brain, everything's sort of all organized and easily accessible. And the same amount of information is on the right, but it's really hard to find it when you need it. So, living with an FASD is often having that messy desk and then think about all the other deficits you may have. So it's like somebody shut the light off and closed the door and you really can't go in and find that information. So they know a lot about a lot. They just need support in accessing that information. And then another area that you might see issues is in their social skills. And we talked a little bit about this when it comes to their social language skills. But And Michelle's going to get into something called developmental dysmaturity, where their chronological age and their developmental age are not the same. So they're often drawn to younger age peers because even though they might be 8, chronologically, developmentally, they might be 4. So you might see them playing with younger kids, and they might have shorter term and sort of that non-reciprocal friendships. And also everybody's their new best friend, right? They really lack that stranger fear and boundaries that other kids might have, and they don't pick up on the subtle cues of relationships. So they can lose friends, they can quickly become great friends, and they can as quickly lose those friends because of their lack of social skills. But they're also at risk for victimization, right? They are very and much, highly vulnerable, and we need to make sure that we're keeping them safe. So kids with an FASD, they struggle, right, with friendships. It's sad to see. So we need to make sure that we're, practicing and building skills. We're role playing how to enter into a situation, how to properly, be in that situation, build skills such as saying no, asking for help. All those things will enhance relationships with other people.
And in camp settings, we have our rules of the day. We have our rules of camp. We often recommend you don't go past 5. And I'm sure a lot of your campers come up with those rules as well. But when social skills happen with kids with an FASD, our response cannot always be, that's not appropriate. We don't talk like that. It has to be more literal. And it has to be normalized for them, not in front of other people, because as we talked about already, they really want to please, they want to be a part of things. And sometimes the way the wording comes out. Also in social skills, you'll see a kid who is the same age as their peers. Let's say they're 11, they're all into Fortnite, and most of the kids are talking about the game in one way, and the other kid with an FASD might be talking about the game in a different way. Don't correct. And if the other kids are getting frustrated at making those corrections, because again, like Karen said, parrots, they can hear words like, I don't even know, but let's just say like bots or mods or whatever they say in games, but they don't use it in the right context. And then their peers are going to want to correct that. And that could cause defensiveness. And that's where the social skills fall apart. And if that happens early on in camp, you've already got a rift between campers. So when you're supporting an individual with an FASD, get to know their language. When you're getting to know, if you know there's an FASD, because these approaches will work with many of your kids, and you might have several who have similar diagnosis or no diagnosis, but these strategies work. But if you know that there's a kid with an FASD, I really implore you to speak to their parent or caregiver about what language they use in the home and what language they use in the school, so it can be transferred to camp so that you're on the same page and you're not frustrated and the camper isn't losing out on that social skill area, because it can be very, very hard for kids to navigate social situations. And again, can be very detrimental to self-esteem in camp.
Okay, and then the last area of sort of difficulty kids with FASD have is in their circadian rhythms. And I would add in their sensory issues into here too, right? So kids with an FASD often are sensory seekers, they're sensory avoiders, or they can be both at the same time. So really understanding when they're feeling hot, when they're feeling hungry, the sensory environment around them can be really impactful for them. But also we need to think about kids with an FASD often have a difficult time with their sleep. So they can come to camp and they can be feeling really tired when they get there because of the difficult time they had sleeping the night before. Often these kids are on some pretty heavy duty medications, and that can impact how they feel or how they eat. So we have to think about that. We have to think about how many spoons do they actually come to camp with in the morning based on these facts. Did they eat their breakfast? Did they have their meds? Did they have a good night's sleep? Did they get in a fight with their parent before, right? All those things are going to impact how they are when they get to camp. So we have to think about too, even, kids should be wearing sunglasses because, the sensory input of sunlight can be overwhelming, and wearing a hat and ensuring they get some water so they stay hydrated. All those things are really important to make sure that their bodies are feeling the best that they can feel too.
in camp, like sensory is huge. And I know as leaders, you build in those days, you know, when it's hot, you build in refreshment breaks, you build in breaks. You will get a lot of kids who will be like, oh my God, it's so hot, I'm so tired. Chances are pretty slim our kids are going to tell you they're hot, or they're going to tell you they're cold. They could be completely drenched in sweat. You need to get information from parent or caregiver about what they eat, because a lot of our kids just aren't going to eat during the day, and you need to make sure that that's kind of okay, but also factor in that the body isn't getting the fuel it needs. And some kids will escalate with sensory, and some kids will, you know, their mood will go downward, but some will absolutely escalate. So what Karen said about sensory is another thing that I think is really important to check in with parents and caregivers about.
Mm-hmm. All right, so actually, Michelle, why don't I do self-regulation and then
Sure.
one of those other key concepts. So self-regulation is, in my mind, a very fancy term for executive functioning, or maybe executive functioning is a fancy term for self-regulation, but regardless, self-regulation can be defined in various ways, and in the most basic sense involves controlling one's behavior, emotions, and thoughts in the pursuits of long-term goals. And more specifically, emotional regulation refers to the ability to manage disruptive moods and emotions and impulses. So really, that to me is the definition of executive functioning. And we really strive for kids to meet that self-regulation target, but for kids with an FASD, that may not happen at the same rate or the same way or ever as a neurotypical kid. So what we want to strive for is co-regulation. We want to help regulate them. We really want us as support people to be the regulators. And it's really important to check our own mood and to be able to co-regulate with them. So here's a nice infographic about steps for offering co-regulation. And, you know, these are things you already know, right? You have to regulate yourself. Kids with an FASD are very good at honing in on how you're feeling about something. If you're feeling overwhelmed or frustrated with behavior, then they're going to feel that, and they're not going to necessarily feel safe with you, and you're going to see even more behavior. So you have to make sure that you're regulating yourself. And then really be empathetic to how difficult it must be on a daily basis to live with FASD. Listen, make eye contact, be curious, and seek to understand. You have to really be a behavioral detective. You can't take behavior at face value. You have to dig a little bit deeper to see what's happening for an individual. And of course, empathetic listening, and offering that affection if that's something that's, of course, allowed with consent. Michelle,
so,
you can take it from here.
Perfect. So as an individual working with and supporting someone with an FASD, you are actually a snowplow. And so we want to talk about focusing on the environment. And what does a snowplow do? Clears the way, makes things safe. That is your role. And it's kind of also that executive assistant that Karen spoke about earlier. So when we focus on the environment, we have to take all of the things that Karen and I have discussed today and put it into a nice little package. We have to think about, it's not being a helicopter. I often say that helicopter parents and helicopter support people are ones that don't want to see, are afraid of mistakes happening, are afraid of those things. We are not. We are plowing the way because we know that we have to have a clear path. We have to know where the barriers are. So now you've learned about language. We know where the barriers are with language and the strengths are with language. And we've learned the barriers to executive functioning and where the strengths are. And when we look at the whole individual, we add in developmental dysmaturity. So now you're going to snowplow, seeing it through the lens of FASD. So developmental disability, this is a perfect illustration. The actual physical age would be 18. Let's just, for the sake of this slide, say an 18-year-old. But their expressive language that Karen spoke about, they can really tell what's happening. They can talk to you. They can parrot back what has been said. So it's a little bit advanced. They're actually, about 20 years old in their expressive language, and that's really impressive. Now remember, FASD is a invisible disability as well. There isn't a benchmark when you look at someone that you would know that they had an FASD. So if you first meet someone and they're just so lovely and charming, and pretty much every parent and family and teacher that we encounter always says, when they're referring to a child or a youth we support, that they're extremely charismatic and they're absolutely cute, adorable, all of those descriptors. So then you might ask them to do some reading of a game. So maybe you have a camper who's a little bit older, who's 11, and you're taking turns reading the rules of a game, or a part of the game is reading. And, you know, they're a little bit slower, but they're reading it just fine. So, but are they comprehending it, right? When we get to social skills, this is a huge fundamental part of esteem in FASD. So you now have this kid who is 11, who you know, looks like a typical 11-year-old, but then really enjoys playing the water balloons with your younger campers at break time. And they really enjoy, maybe there's a show, like, it's not uncommon for kids with an FASD to be 10 or 11 and still like Paw Patrol. They can keep up with their friends, but they really like Paw Patrol. Or there's shows that they've always watched that they still watch. But what's interesting is not all of them will tell that to a social circle, because we find that somewhere is it that they know, or that nobody else is talking about it and they haven't been cued to talk about it. So when we see those social skills that are underdeveloped at camp, we have to make a pathway for them. We have to snowplow a path. And what that means in camp is being present, supervision, supervision, supervision. It doesn't have to be right beside them holding their hand, but it means eye shot and earshot at all times. We are not going to explain social developmental dysmaturity and social skills to other campers by saying, well, you know, he has FASD, they have FASD, she has FASD. That's not how we explain it. We do that co-regulation. So we interfere where we need, we distract, we detract, and we don't always focus on the person with the social skills that are behind. So an example is a kid is in camp and comes up with a fact. The fact, something that really doesn't make sense, but to them, their brain is perseverated on it and they're going to keep talking about it. Other campers are getting frustrated. Your response is, that is so cool. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. Can I get your help over here? And you will often find a distraction that could be physical, sometimes a bit of hand clapping, you know, at camp where we have the let's go campers and it changes everybody and gets their attention. Teachers are brilliant at this. Kids will be like, okay, well, I'm on to something else now. That we don't have to dwell on it, but we have to make sure that we're aware of it. We have to be aware of it when there might be games that kids come to camp and just can't play. So you've got 25 kids and one kid can't play that game, but maybe you have younger campers on site and maybe that camper is really good at setting up younger kids' games and crafts. And that is part of their camp experience. And there's nothing wrong with doing that with them. But it's really important to know, as you might have older kids in camp, you might have a 12-year-old. Some camps go up to age 13. You might have a young guy, like male identifying camper who has like a little bit of mustache peach fuzz, but likes to hang out with the younger kids. And people think, well, what's that about? It's about nothing. It's just hormones causing the body to look one way and developmental dysmaturity causing the reaction to be different, right? Emotional maturity is even a little bit lower. So, you know, when 11-year-olds might lose at a game, or I think about it as like a 6-year-old losing at a game, right? We're expecting them to act like they're in grade 1, but really if they're like more 3, they're going to have a meltdown. And how do you respond to that meltdown? You sit down beside them. We're not going to lecture. We're not going to, you know, give them consequences. We're just going to do that kind of time in, be close, keep safe. So whatever situation you're looking at, we kind of, as a rule of thumb, kind of cut the age in half, but know that they can't always be treated that way all the time. You'll get to know your campers, but just look at it from a perspective of cutting the age in half and how you would expect, you know, maybe a typical 13-year-old could go to the mall with their friends on a bus, but would a 7-year-old be able to do that?
And Michelle, I just flipped to this
Perfect.
slide because it just demonstrates exactly what you're talking about.
Exactly. And you can pause this because this is the beauty of webinar. You can pause this. You also can just take a look through it, what we expect of a 13-year-old, but what if they actually had the brain of an 8-year-old? So it's things like reminding and daily tasks. And we really mean this. Just because I always say Joe, it's a name that comes easy to me. Joe comes to camp on Monday and Tuesday, gung ho and ready to camp, and tells you all the rules. And then on Wednesday comes and kind of looks lost. And you're like, well, what did we do yesterday, Joe? And Joe goes, I don't know. We flew kites. And then you're like, we don't have kites here. And he'll be like, yeah, so, because his brain is trying to find that information. So every day we have visuals, we have role play. If you're going for walks, okay, Joe might be 13, but is 8-year-olds still need to be in pairs. And an 8-year-old with an FASD at school would have an adult close by them. They wouldn't be too close in proximity to those peers that maybe escalate them a bit. They wouldn't necessarily be left alone for long periods of time. If you're headed to the bathroom, we do not follow children into the bathroom clearly, but we might want to keep an eye on how long we've been in there because distractions happen. Impatience and waiting is very difficult. So it's hard for other kids to understand, but oftentimes we have to let those kids with FASD go first. Let them be at the front of the line or towards the front of the line. When they say, I'll go first, let them go first. And yes, other kids will get upset about it, but in the grand scheme of things, how much easier is it for you to explain that or demonstrate it better than explain to the neurotypical kids and the kid with an FASD? When really you're accommodating that kid and giving them a great experience, that they are not able to understand that explanation in the reverse. Adult organization, structure and guidance all day long. Structure, supervision is the key to great camp. Free time at camp, I know that it's not something that camp often does. We don't encourage it, but often it's towards the end of the day. And if you have an extended day environment for aftercare, my biggest suggestion is, though kids might look like they have a lot of energy, do not engage in high energy games. Find an interest that they really like and see if it's something that they would like to do and build upon, or start a project on a Monday if they're there for 1 week of camp and work on it in that time for the rest of the week. Ask them what they'd like to do. Oftentimes we think high energy is great and it's really not. The spoons are depleted. Their ability to refocus and recenter is going to be diminished. And then that sensory piece is also going to escalate. They're going to overheat. They might dehydrate. So just keep that in mind. Tends to be active and lots of touching. So we get to a certain age, usually by grade 2, we've got hands to ourselves a lot more. Grade 3, really hands to ourselves. But what if you have a kid who's in grade 5 or 6 and has a lot of hands-on, or even a kid who's in grade 2 who developmentally is behind? They're going to have a lot of hands-on. Karen and I support a lot of kids who are in school, and when teachers get in touch with us of the junior and SK grades, the chief concern is that no matter what we do, they can't keep their hands to themselves. And it has a lot to do with that dysmaturity, that brain function, so they present more of a younger age. And friendships, totally in the moment. Everyone's their best friend. Don't be surprised if you get invited for dinner or you're asked for your phone number, because we're best friends now. Their boundaries are not there. Do you play games online? What's your username? I want to play games with you. And it's perfectly fine to say, I'm not allowed to do that because I work here, but thank you for the invite. That's it. That's it. You don't have to get too into it. They're not being creepy or untoward. They just think, hey, you are my best friend. We've hung out together all week. And then we talk about structure because we talk about spoons, right? So we want to keep as much of that executive functioning fuel as we can. So we create thinking free days. So what has happened for a lot of us adults is phones have taken over thinking for us. They tell us what the weather is. They tell us when to get up. They tell us when to take medication. We can program our phones as our thinking free days, right? So we want thinking free days. So routines and structure. Camps, you guys are so great at having big visual schedules and knowing what's happening, everything inside and outside and all kinds of things happening, making sure there's schedules, making sure that the schedules are easy, low, like visually appeasing, but as few words as possible. Building habits. We build habits through positive interactions. Doesn't mean that an individual with FASD is going to follow them every day, but you would be surprised, especially if you have those campers that come for 6 weeks. By about week 3, if they're coming consistently, by week 3, they probably, not always, will come and do the basics in the morning. You know, I have to put my backpack here. I got to put my water bottle here. I have to put my, they'll do all of that. but don't lead that to expect you to think that they're also going to be able to do everything else in the day. You have helped them to build that habit. Repetition, repetition, repetition. We often refer to our lives as Groundhog Day. Things are the same, same, same. Do not be surprised if you have a lot of the same conversations interactively as well. And then consistency. Don't, things like, you know, sometimes if your camp numbers are low, the weather changes, have a backup plan and have it kind of advertised. Willy-nilly, going with the flow will not be successful for a lot of kids that have developmental disability, not just in FASD. So even on your rain days, have a backup plan that can be known and be consistent as possible. And in society, we talk, this is a little video from Dan Dabowski, and we want to just start having individuals like yourself think about the difference between interdependence and independence when it comes to FASD and developmental disability.
And then we think that we've developed this concept that fostering dependency and enabling people is a bad thing to do. So if we have a parent who never shows up on time for their appointments in school, to arrange to either pick them up or get them there, or make the appointment at a time when they can get there, or go to see them, is just fostering dependency. That's not a good thing. And I can't tell you how many times I hear from people, and I just heard this recently at another training I was doing, they have to learn to do these things on their own because that's the real world. The real world doesn't have people who are going to help them with these things, so they have to do it on their own. And if they could do it on their own, they wouldn't need our supports. While they have our supports, we need to provide them for them. But again, that idea that fostering dependency is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing because all of us need that level of dependency. We need to build that. Again, when I used to train case managers, I would look at treatment plans, and every single treatment plan had people, and this was older children, adolescents, and adults, that their goal was to live independently in the community. And when I taught case managers, I would say, how many of you live independently in the community? And a few people raised their hands, and I would say, that means you don't count on anybody for anything at any point in your entire life. And they would put their hands down. And I would say, you know, what we want to do is foster interdependence, which means that we want to build a safety net so that they know who they can count on, who they can go to. Probably the most important thing for youth with an FASD, I think, or one of the most important things, is to identify a person they can go to anytime they are not sure about something. The idea that they will learn how to read things properly, how to respond properly in situations, how to recognize dangerous people or dangerous situations is setting them up to fail. If we can teach them anytime you're not sure about something, you call me, and here's your backup person, that to me is the real goal. Anytime you're not sure about something, here's who you call, here's who you go to.
So that means for camp, if you're a supervisor watching this training, please try and keep your teams as consistent as possible. And I know that when you have inclusion, that's really important. There's nothing better than being in our work and having families tell us that, you know, their child went to camp and they had this inclusion worker named so-and-so, and like, Michelle, Karen, can you make sure they have that person again next year? It's out of our control, but we certainly pass it along. So that type of consistency is important. And we work with parents too. So parents and caregivers who are in the FASD community, we talk to them too about camp. You know, camp is seen as a form of respite, and we want them to make sure that when they're putting their kids in camp, it works. You know, it might work for their perspective for childcare, but is it beneficial to have them in weeks 1, 3, and 6? Is that going to be too much of a gap? Is it better if they go weeks 1, 2, and 3? Because every individual is different. So that's the type of interdependence that we're trying to build in all environments so that we can keep consistency. And so the old way of thinking is that behavior, and this is where I like to kind of address some of the ways we might be addressing things at camp. So behavior is negative, it's purposeful, it's voluntary, but really we have to look at it as the person's needs are not being met. And The onus of change cannot be on the individuals living with an FASD or developmental disability. When there's a pattern of negative behavior, there's missing information. And the onus of change is on the environment and caregivers. And you, in your role in camp, are a caregiver. And so camp has to have rules, right? We have 25 to 40 kids together that don't know each other. We put them all in a space together for 1 week, for 5 weeks, for 6 weeks, for 8 weeks, however long your camp runs. So we have to really be thinking about what that looks like. And so we know that in society, we reward positive behavior, right? So we might say something like, if everybody listens, we're going to get freezies at the end of the day. If someone with an FASD or developmental disability is in that group, regardless, you're going to have to give everybody freezies that day. So save yourself the hassle of making that an incentive. So find ways that it's built into your day without being something special, without being something disciplinary or behavior focused, because they're not going to be able to follow through. One time in camp, I had this really eager group of leaders in training and leaders, and they really wanted to do something, and the kids really wanted to do it. They saved it up till the Friday, this activity. And they were having a lot of challenges in camp that week, and they had come down to speak to the team, and I heard them speaking to their supervisor, like, well, basically what we told everybody is if they don't do this, then they don't get this activity on Friday. I felt bad for my staff member because I came right out of my office because they knew what was coming. Absolutely not. I'm not saying that everybody would do that, and I'm not saying it's bad or wrong, but knowing what you know now about FASD, and you've already told the whole group that this activity is going to happen on Friday, there is no understanding there. There's no linking that we didn't behave, I didn't behave. And what if the kids are like, well, we would have done it if this kid, and they point out the kid with an FASD who fell out of line or didn't do something. That has negative long-term impacts. And it's not always easily communicated, but it is communicated through behavior. And then we have to think when a kid goes home from camp, right? We have to think of what their caregivers deal with and their parents deal with on a regular basis. So we have to think of ways to build incentive without it being consequential. And we can't put the onus on the campers we have to kind of put it on us as facilitators to make the experience more valuable. And I hope that makes sense. And at any time, Karen and I, our contact information is on the last slide, which we'll get to. Oh, there it is. Our information is here. So if you have any questions at all about what you've listened to today, or you want more information, we also, I don't know if you belong to school programs or in your personal professional life where you would like more training on FASD, that is what Karen and I do. And we're happy to visit as many groups as we possibly can to help build FASD informed communities. We appreciate you being with us today. We hope you have a wonderful camp season, and thank you for taking the time.